For 5 years, the pilgrimage was a ritual of pain. 5 years, the Apache warrior Achok walked to the lonely pile of stones that marked his wife's grave, carrying a grief so heavy it felt like a second man walking inside his skin. But this year was different. This year, someone was there. A small figure knelt by the stones, its back to him. A child. Sun-bleached hair, the faded dress of a settler, an intruder in his sanctuary of sorrow. Achok's hand went to his knife. A cold fire, the only warmth he'd felt in half a decade, burned in his gut. This was a desecration, a child of the people who had burned his world to ash, kneeling at the very center of that ash heap. He took a step, the crunch of his moccasin on the dry earth loud as a gunshot. The girl turned, and the world stopped. She wasn't afraid. A settler child faced with a lone Apache warrior should have been terrified. But her eyes, dark and wide, held only a quiet curiosity, an unnerving familiarity that seemed to look right through the warrior and see the hollowed-out man inside. His breath caught. He meant to tell her to leave, to get off this sacred ground. But the words wouldn't come, because in the curve of her brow, in the shape of her eyes, he saw a ghost. He saw his wife, Liana. It was impossible, a trick of the sun, of a mind starved for comfort. He blinked, trying to shatter the mirage, but the image held. Stubborn, achingly real. He had built a fortress of grief around his heart, and this impossible hope was a crack in the wall. He had to seal it. This was a settler's child, a symbol of his loss, not a reversal of it. But then his eyes, trained to see every detail, every broken twig, every shifted stone, were drawn to her hand. She was clutching something, a small dark object. At first it was just a shape, but as he focused, the sound of the wind died. The heat of the sun vanished. There was only the object in her small hand. It was a bird, carved from dark wood, and one of its wings was crooked. A violent tremor shot through Achak's body. He wasn't in the present anymore. He was back 5 years by a low fire, a knife in his hand. He could feel the slip of the blade that made the wing imperfect. He could hear Liana's soft laugh, telling him it gave the bird character. He remembered placing it in the tiny 2-year-old hand of his daughter, his little dove. It wasn't a similar toy, it was the toy. The fortress around his heart didn't just crack, it was obliterated. Just as the impossible truth began to crash down on him, a man's voice called out from a distance, "Sarafina!" Achak tore his eyes from the bird. A settler was approaching, his face etched with the hardships of the frontier, his hands held open in a gesture of peace. He called himself Elias Vance. He said he meant no disrespect. He said he'd found a little girl, wandering alone in the desert 5 years ago. A child too young to speak her name, her mind wiped clean by some horror he could only guess at. A silent survivor of some terrible conflict. And the only thing she carried, the only clue to her entire past, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Every word Elias Vance spoke was another hammer blow against the world Achak knew. The timeline, the location, the unmistakable toy. The threads of his past and this stranger's present were converging right here, at his wife's grave, weaving a tapestry of fate that was both a miracle and a nightmare. This wasn't a settler's child. This wasn't a ghost. This was his blood, his flesh. He saw his little dove, saved from the fire, preserved by a stranger's kindness, and returned to him by a power he could not comprehend. The ice around his heart didn't melt. It shattered. A torrent of grief, relief, disbelief, and a love so fierce it was a physical pain, rushed in and stole his breath. The warrior, the stoic survivor, ceased to exist. In his place was a man brought to his knees by a miracle. The dry, cracked earth met his knees, but he felt nothing. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, guttural noise that was half sob, half prayer. It was the sound of 5 years of unshed tears being released in a single, searing flood. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He stripped away the settler's dress, the unfamiliar name. He saw the way her hair caught the light, just like Liana's. He saw the stubborn set of her chin, a mirror of his own. He had no words. Language was useless. Slowly, with a hand that trembled, he reached out. An open palm, scarred and empty, asking only to be filled. She looked at his hand, and in her eyes there was no fear, only a deep, profound stillness. Some ancient memory, a bond of blood and bone, seemed to recognize him. With a small, graceful movement, she placed her hand in his. The contact was an electric jolt, a current of life that surged up his arm and filled the hollow space in his chest. A family, violently torn apart, was suddenly, impossibly, whole again. It was Elias who finally broke the sacred silence. He filled in the gaps. He spoke of his own wife, Martha, who had loved the girl fiercely before she passed from a fever. It was Martha who insisted on the name Seraphina, because she seemed like a little spirit. Then Elias revealed something that made the hairs on a hawk's neck stand up. Martha, too, had been the sole survivor of a raid in her childhood, a tragedy that scarred her soul. Before she died, she made Elias promise to keep bringing the girl to this spot. She couldn't explain why. She just said she felt the girl's past was not a ghost to be outrun, but a spirit waiting to be met, and that this ground, for reasons she could not name, felt like home. It was as if Leanna's spirit had called out across the veil, and another woman's wounded heart had heard the echo, guiding his daughter back to him, year after year. Elias looked from the warrior's tear-streaked face to the child's calm one. He saw the undeniable truth. He had been a caretaker of a life that belonged to another. But he also saw the rage and grief that had shaped this man. He had a duty not just to the past, but to the child's future. "I see the truth," Elias said, his voice steady. "But there is a chasm between our worlds. She knows only my ways, my language. She must choose to cross it." He looked directly at Achak, the father, and set forth his condition. "She must choose it," he said again. "Before she rides away with you, you must stay among us. Let her see the man you are, not just the father you were. Let her see you are not the monster our children are taught to fear. Her heart may know you, but her mind does not. You must win her trust, not as a right, but as a gift. Only when she is ready to take your hand without my presence beside her, will I know she is truly home." The world of Elias Vance was a cage. The wooden homestead, the fenced-in corral, the grid of struggling crops. It was a place of straight lines and sharp corners, a stark defiance to the land's natural curves. For Achak, it was a place of profound discord. The air was thick with alien smells: salted pork, lye soap, the metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge. He was a creature of the open plains. These walls felt like they were slowly crushing him. Ilias gave him a space in the barn, a gesture of trust that felt more like a leash. Every settler who passed cast long, sideways glances, their eyes a mixture of fear and hostile curiosity. He was a specter at their feast, a living reminder of the violence that haunted the edges of their fragile existence. Elias's condition echoed in his mind. Win her trust, not as a right, but as a gift. Words were useless. His language was foreign to her, and the settler's tongue felt clumsy in his mouth. So he began his courtship of his daughter's heart in the only way he knew how, through the silent language of the earth. He would sit for hours in the shade of the barn, a piece of cottonwood in his hand, his knife moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He carved a coyote, then a hawk, then a desert tortoise, a small, silent menagerie. He never called to her. He never motioned for her to come closer. He simply created, and he waited. And she, his little dove, began to watch. At first it was from the safety of the porch, her small form partially hidden behind a post. Then day by day, the distance between them shrank. She would sit on a nearby barrel, her head cocked to the side, her dark eyes following the movement of his hands. He was a puzzle she was slowly, cautiously piecing together. He began to show her things. Without speaking, he would point. He showed her how the smallest trail in the dust revealed the passage of a lizard. He cupped his hand to his ear, his eyes closed, and then pointed to a distant mesa just as the cry of a circling hawk reached them. He showed her which leaves curled just before the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. These were not lessons, they were offerings. He was showing her the world he saw, a world not of danger and scarcity, but of subtle signs and deep connection. And in these silent moments, the bridge Elias had spoken of began to form, woven not from words, but from shared observation. She began to leave him small gifts in return: a uniquely shaped stone, a vibrant feather, a handful of wildflowers. They were her words, her quiet acceptance. Meanwhile, a different kind of tension was growing. The late summer heat was relentless. The well was drawing more mud than water. The small creek that fed their livestock had dwindled to a sluggish, muddy trickle. A palpable fear, drier and hotter than the air itself, began to settle over the homesteads. They spoke in hushed, worried tones of a nearby spring, their last resort in times of drought. But even that had run dry. They were facing the slow, merciless death of thirst, a reality that would force them to abandon the homes they had fought so hard to build. Achak watched their panic with a detached calm. He saw them digging uselessly, praying uselessly. They were looking for water where it had been, not where it had gone. His knowledge, born from generations of living with the land, not on it, gave him a different perspective. He saw not an absence, but a diversion. One morning he walked the perimeter of the parched land, his eyes on the larger story told by the landscape. He saw a line of wilting, deep-rooted mesquite that should have been thriving. He saw the unusual behavior of ants, their colonies migrating uphill. He saw a faint, almost invisible depression in the earth that spoke of a collapsed badger den. To the settlers, it was a random collection of natural events. To Achak, it was a map. The water was still there, flowing deep underground, but its path had been choked off miles away. He went to Elias. With gestures and a few settler words, he explained what he had seen. He pointed not to the dry spring, but to the hills beyond. There was deep skepticism in Elias's eyes, but it was overshadowed by desperation. With nothing left to lose, he agreed. He gathered two other men, their faces grim with doubt. It was a strange procession. Three armed settlers following a single, unarmed Apache warrior into the wilderness, trusting in a knowledge they could not comprehend. After 2 hours under the brutal sun, Achak stopped. He pointed to a recent rockfall at the base of a small canyon, a jumble of stones and earth that looked unremarkable. He motioned for them to start digging. The men exchanged doubtful glances, but Elias gave a firm nod. As they began to move the rocks, a faint dampness in the soil gave way to dark, rich mud. And then they heard it, a low, gurgling sound. A small, clear trickle of water appeared, then grew stronger, freed from its earthen prison, the lifeblood of the spring, flowing once more. A moment of stunned silence fell over the men. They looked from the life-giving water to the Apache warrior, and for the first time, their eyes held not fear, but a flicker of awe. But that fragile moment was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle being cocked. A man stood on the ridge above them, his weapon aimed squarely at Ashok's chest. His name was Thorn, a rancher whose family had been lost in a raid years ago. A man whose hatred for the Apache was the bedrock of his existence. "Get away from him, Elias!" Thorn's voice boomed, sharp and cold as steel. "I knew you were a fool, but I never thought you were a traitor. Is he leading you into a trap?" All the progress, all the quiet understanding, evaporated in an instant. In Thorn's eyes, Akak was not a father, not a savior. He was the enemy, and the price for finding water was a rifle aimed directly at his heart. The world narrowed to the space between the muzzle of Thorn's rifle and the center of Ashok's chest. The fragile respect he had just earned turned to dust, blown away by the hot wind of old hatred. Elias immediately stepped between them, his hands raised, his voice a desperate plea for reason. He tried to explain the miracle of the water, but his words were like stones thrown against a fortress wall. Thorn's eyes were not seeing the present. They were fixed on a memory of smoke and fire and loss. In his mind, every Apache was the one who had taken his family. The two other settlers, caught between their newfound gratitude and their ingrained fear, stood frozen, their loyalty shifting with every heated word. Achak, however, remained unnervingly still. He wasn't looking at the rifle. He wasn't looking at the face of the man who wished him dead. His senses, honed by a life lived in tune with the natural world, were screaming a different warning. It was not a warning of man, but of the earth itself. He felt it first as a faint tremor through the soles of his moccasins, a low hum that the settlers, deafened by their own argument, could not perceive. The ground beneath them, already loosened by their digging and now being saturated by the newly flowing water, was unstable. The rockfall was a wound in the land, and they were standing at its most vulnerable point. He could hear the faint, sickening groan of rock grinding against rock, a sound that came just before a catastrophic collapse. The argument about the past was about to be silenced by the violence of the present. His mind worked with the cold, swift clarity of a striking hawk. There was no time for words, no time for persuasion. There was only time for action. In a single explosive movement, he lunged forward. But he did not attack Thorn. He shoved Elias and the man next to him with a force that sent them stumbling backward, out of the immediate danger zone. He shouted a single guttural word in his own tongue, a command that meant only one thing. Move. Thorn, startled, flinched, his finger tightening on the trigger. But in that split second of hesitation, Achak was already past him. He ignored the rifle aimed at his back and scrambled toward the rockslide. He wasn't running from the danger. He was running to its heart. He had seen what the others had not. A single large boulder, a keystone holding the most volatile section of the slide in place. To prevent a massive, uncontrollable collapse, he had to trigger a smaller, strategic one. He grabbed a discarded pickaxe. The groan of the earth was louder now, a deep, guttural roar building from beneath them. With all the strength in his body, he swung the pickaxe, striking the base of the keystone rock. The metal rang out. The rock held for a moment, and then, with a deafening crack, it gave way. Achak threw himself to the side as tons of rock, dirt, and debris cascaded down, not in a wide, sweeping avalanche, but in a contained, focused torrent, crashing into the very space where the men had been standing just seconds before. The dust plume was immense, choking the air and blotting out the sun. The roar was absolute. When the final echoes died away and the dust began to settle, a profound silence descended upon the canyon. The men picked themselves up, shaken and covered in dirt, but alive. The spring was not buried. In fact, the slide had cleared its channel even further. The water now flowed with a confident, steady pulse. They all stared, breathless, at the spot where Ashok lay, partially covered by debris. For a moment, they thought he was lost. But then he moved, pushing himself up, his face grim, his body bruised, but his eyes clear and alive. He had saved them all. He had saved the water. He had saved the man who was about to kill him. As he got to his feet, his gaze fell upon something metallic, half buried in the fresh earth where the keystone boulder had been. It was a U.S. Army cavalry saber. Its blade snapped, its hilt tarnished by years underground. It was not a relic of an ancient battle. The placement, the way it had been wedged deep into the rockfall, made its purpose chillingly clear. This was not a natural event. The spring had been deliberately sabotaged. The standoff was forgotten. Elias and the others gathered around, their faces a mask of confusion and dawning horror. But it was Thorn who moved first. He lowered his rifle, the weapon suddenly clumsy and irrelevant. He walked forward, his steps heavy, and knelt, picking up the broken sword. He stared at it, his knuckles white. The fury in his eyes was gone, replaced by a terrible, cold light of understanding. He looked up at Achak, and the chasm of hatred between them vanished, replaced by a terrifying, unspoken bridge of shared truth. His voice when he spoke was a ragged whisper meant for Achak alone. "The raid," he said, the words tearing from his throat. "The men who killed my wife and son. They rode horses shod with army steel. I told everyone they were Apache raiders in disguise. They called me a madman." He did not offer thanks. He did not offer an apology. He offered something far more significant, a shared enemy. The water brought more than life back to the arid land. It washed away the sharp edges of fear and suspicion. In the days that followed, a profound shift occurred. Achak was no longer a phantom haunting the edges of their community, but a tangible presence, a man who had faced death to save them. The settlers' glances were no longer sharp with hostility, but softened with a grudging respect. He was given the quiet space to begin the most important work of his life, rebuilding his world around his daughter. The bridge of trust between Ashik and his little dove was no longer a fragile, silent thing. It was now paved with laughter. Her fear of the tall, quiet man had been replaced by a boundless fascination. She would follow him like a small shadow, her questions a constant bubbling stream. He in turn found that the words came more easily his voice hoarse from years of disuse, finding a new rhythm in answering her. He taught her the names of the stars in his own tongue, stories of the trickster coyote and the wise eagle. For the first time in 5 years, Achak felt the thaw of a long and bitter winter. He was not just a mourner or a warrior, he was a father. His relationship with the settlers also found a new, strange equilibrium. Elias Vance would often join him on the porch as the sun bled across the horizon, the two of them sharing a comfortable silence that transcended the need for a common language. Two fathers, two widowers, bound by their love for the same child. And then there was Thorn. The alliance between them was a grim, unspoken thing, a partnership forged in the shadow of a shared enemy. Thorn would approach Achak not with words but with offerings, a freshly sharpened knife, a piece of cured leather. Gestures of a man acknowledging a debt and recognizing a peer. Thorn's hatred had been a wildfire. Now it was focused like a beam of light on a distant, faceless foe. One quiet evening, as Little Dove slept inside, Elias and Achak sat watching a soft rain begin to fall. Ellis began speaking of his late wife, Martha. He talked about her kindness, her quiet strength, and the peculiar little symbol she used to sew onto their linens. A small, intricate pattern of a star surrounded by a circle of leaves. She had told him it was a charm for protection, a pattern she had learned as a young girl. She had gotten lost in the wilderness, and an Apache woman, she had said, had found her, given her water, and led her back to the trail, teaching her the symbol as a way to remember that kindness could be found in the most unexpected of places. As Elias described the pattern, a chill, entirely separate from the cooling rain, crept down Ashok's spine. He slowly unsheathed the knife at his belt. It was his most prized possession, not for the blade, but for the sheath Liana had made for him. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers tracing the worn beaded pattern on the leather. There, faded by time and use but still unmistakable, was the exact same symbol, a star surrounded by a delicate circle of leaves. He held it out for Elias to see. The settler's eyes widened, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. The truth descended upon them both, a revelation so profound it felt as if the spirits themselves were speaking. Liana, Ashok's lost love, had been the stranger who saved Elias's future wife. Their families had been connected long before they knew it, their fates intertwined by an act of kindness, a thread of grace woven through the fabric of their violent world. It was no accident they were here. They were fulfilling a destiny set in motion years ago. The sense of peace that settled over Achak was deeper than any he had ever known. His daughter was safe. His past and present were connected by a circle of fate. The world, for a brief, beautiful moment, felt whole. But the desert does not allow for long seasons of peace. The next afternoon, as the land steamed under the sun, Little Dove was playing near the mouth of the now gushing spring. She ran back to Achak, her small face alight with excitement, her hand clutching a newfound treasure. It was a small metal disc, shiny and round. She offered it to him, a gift from the earth. Achak took it, his smile fading as he felt its cold, uniform weight. He turned it over. On its face was the embossed image of an eagle, the unmistakable insignia of the United States Cavalry. He looked from the button in his palm toward the hills, his eyes narrowing. The peace of the last few days shattered like glass. The men who had tried to choke the life from this land were not a distant memory. They were a present danger. And this small metal disc was a sign they had been back. And they were close. The small brass button lay heavy in Ashok's palm, a cold omen. The past was no longer a ghost. It was a hunting party, and it was coming for them. He did not need to speak when he showed the button to Thorn. The rancher's face, already a landscape of harsh lines, seemed to carve itself from granite. The unspoken alliance, forged in shared trauma, now became a council of war. There, in the fading light, the Apache warrior and the settler whose family he had once been accused of destroying planned the defense of their shared home. Elias and the other men were brought into the circle of grim knowledge. The fear that returned to their faces was different now. It was not the shapeless dread of a phantom raid, but the cold, clear terror of a known enemy. An enemy who wore the uniform of their own government, who had already tried to kill them once with thirst, and would now surely return to finish the job with lead. Achak was no longer a guest or a curiosity. He was their commander. The land was his ally, and he taught the settlers to speak its language. He showed them how the narrow ravines could become traps, how a stand of dense brush could conceal their small number, how the morning sun could be used to blind a careless rider. He worked with a fierce, focused energy that left the others breathless. Every rock he moved, every trail he camouflaged, was a prayer for his daughter's life. He was defending a future he had only just reclaimed from the ashes. The settlers, trusting the man who had brought them water, followed his instructions without question. They turned their homesteads into a fortress, not of high walls, but of cunning and desperation. A web of deadly surprises woven into the familiar landscape. They waited. The silence of the desert filled with a new, terrible tension. The attack came, as Achak had predicted, at dawn. A dozen riders in blue uniforms crested the hill, their movements not those of a standard patrol, but of a predator closing in on its prey. They were led by a captain with a cold, impassive face, a man who clearly expected to find a community weakened and dying of thirst. The first volley of gunfire came not from the homesteads, but from the rocks above, Thorne's rifle barking out a deadly welcome. The soldiers, caught by surprise, scattered for cover. Achak's strategy was working. The settlers, hidden in positions he had chosen, fought with the ferocity of cornered animals, their knowledge of the terrain momentarily leveling the odds. The blue-coated soldiers were confused, their superior numbers and training negated by an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. But the tide of the battle began to turn in a way Achak had not anticipated. The soldiers, despite their initial confusion, began to adapt too quickly. They seemed to know where to concentrate their fire, anticipating the settlers' movements with an unnatural prescience. Achak, moving between the defensive positions, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just good leadership from the captain. It was information from a high vantage point. He scanned the battlefield, not for the enemy, but for the flaw in his own defense. And then he saw it, a flash of light from a ridge near the homestead, far from the main fighting. It was a settler named Jasper, a quiet, resentful man who had kept to the fringes of the community. He was holding a small mirror, angling it in the sun, sending coated flashes of light toward the cavalry captain. The betrayal was a physical blow, more stunning than any bullet. The enemy was not just at their gates, he had been living beside them all along. With Jasper's signals guiding them, the soldiers regrouped. Their assault, now precise and deadly, bypassed the traps and began a direct, overwhelming push toward the main homestead, where Elias was guarding the women and children. Guarding Little Dove, Achak saw the end coming. They would be overrun in minutes. Their small victories had been erased by a single act of treachery. A choice presented itself, stark and absolute. He could stay and die fighting, a footnote in a forgotten massacre. Or he could change the nature of the fight. He had to make himself a more valuable target than the homestead. He had to draw the wolves away. With a final, determined look toward the house where his daughter was hidden, he made his sacrifice. He lit a bundle of oil-soaked rags he had prepared as a last resort, throwing it into a patch of dry chaparral. The brush erupted in a wall of flame and smoke, creating a diversion that momentarily confused the soldiers. In that moment of confusion, Achak broke cover. He ran into the open, letting out a piercing war cry that drew every eye toward him. He fired an arrow that struck the hat from the captain's head, an act of singular, defiant challenge. He was no longer a hidden strategist. He was the target. He turned his back on the home he had fought to protect and ran, a lone Apache warrior disappearing into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The thunder of a dozen cavalry horses, turning from the homestead and giving chase, their fury now focused entirely on him. The wilderness was not a place of refuge, it was a weapon, and Achak wielded it with the skill of a master. The thunder of hooves behind him was a relentless drumbeat, but it was a sound he understood. He led his pursuers not on a chase, but on a death march, a carefully orchestrated journey through the harshest, most unforgiving territory he knew. He became a ghost, a whisper in the canyons, his moccasined feet leaving almost no trace on the stone. He used the land's cruelty as his shield and its illusions as his sword. A cleverly placed pile of rocks sent the lead rider's horse tumbling, breaking its leg and the soldier's resolve. He led them into a box canyon where the echoes played tricks on their ears, making them fire at shadows until their ammunition ran low. He climbed where horses could not follow, forcing them to dismount, their heavy boots and woolen uniforms a curse under the oppressive sun. He was not simply running, he was systematically dismantling the machine of their pursuit, piece by bloody piece. The captain, a man accustomed to command and control, felt his authority dissolving in the heat and the dust. His men were growing tired, their horses lame, their fear mounting with every unseen threat. His frustration curdled into a reckless fury. He pushed them onward, driven by the personal insult of the arrow that had stolen his hat and the warrior who had stolen his victory. He eventually split his forces, a classic tactical error born of arrogance, sending half his men on a fool's errand down a false trail Ashok had laid. Now the odds were closer to even. The final act of this drama would be played on a stage of Ashok's choosing, a high, windswept mesa dotted with the crumbling ruins of the Anasazi, the ancient ones, a sacred, silent place where the spirits of the past watched over the follies of the present. The confrontation, when it came, was one of exhaustion and iron will. The captain, separated from the last of his men, finally cornered Achok against a cliff face. The soldier's uniform was torn, his face sunburned and streaked with sweat, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. He raised his pistol, the click of the hammer echoing in the vast silence. He saw a cornered savage, a final problem to be dispatched. But the man who faced him was not cornered. He was exactly where he wanted to be. And for the first time in their long pursuit, Achak spoke to him in his own language, his voice low and steady, each word a carefully aimed blow. He spoke of the sabotage spring, of the broken saber. He described the faces of Thorn's wife and child, painting a picture of the massacre with details only a survivor could know. He revealed the betrayal of the settler, Jasper, proving he knew the captain had an inside source. This was the attack the captain was unprepared for, an assault of truth, dismantling his self-perception as a soldier and recasting him as a common murderer for hire. Enraged and unnerved, the captain fired, but his aim was wild. The bullet ricocheted off the rock face, whining into the sky. Before he could fire again, Achak moved, using the captain's lunging momentum to throw him off balance. The pistol skittered across the stone. The fight was now primal, a desperate struggle of knife against brute strength at the edge of the world. But the final decisive blow came from a source the captain could never have imagined. A single, sharp rifle shot rang out, not from the valley below, but from a ledge above them. The shot did not strike either man. It hit the ground between them, an undeniable command to cease. Both men looked up. Thorne stood there, his rifle held steady, his face a mask of cold judgment. He was not alone. Behind him stood Elias, and between them, his hands bound, was the traitor Jasper, his face a mess of bruises and terror. Thorne's voice boomed across the mesa, carrying with it the weight of a judge and jury. He announced that Jasper had confessed everything, the name of the powerful man in Santa Fe who had paid him, the cavalry captain's role as his enforcer, and the plan to drive every last settler from the valley. He had been a witness all along. The captain's authority, built on the power of his uniform and the fear he inspired, evaporated in an instant. He was no longer a military officer. He was a criminal, exposed and outmaneuvered. He made one last desperate lunge for his pistol, but Achak was faster. The fight ended not with a gunshot, but with the silent, decisive efficiency of a warrior reclaiming his world. The immediate threat was over. The remaining soldiers, finding their leader gone and seeing the armed settlers, quickly surrendered. But as the dust settled, the victory felt incomplete. The world was still a dangerous place. While searching the captain's saddlebags, Elias found a folded document. It was not a letter, but a surveyor's map. It detailed a plan funded by a wealthy consortium to build a new railroad spur line directly through the valley, a line that required the land to be completely empty. Their small homestead, the Apache hunting grounds, all of it was marked for erasure, designated as uninhabited territory. They had won the battle, defeating the captain and his men. But the map was proof that they had not yet faced the true enemy. They had only defeated a single piece in a much larger, more ruthless game. Their future was no longer about survival, but about their place in a war they had only just discovered they were fighting. 1 year passed. A full cycle of seasons turned, and the land, healed by the steady flow of the spring, gave back its bounty. The fear that had once haunted the small settlement did not vanish entirely. It remained as a healthy vigilance, a shared knowledge that they lived on the edge of a war they had not started, but were now sworn to finish. But fear, they discovered, was a poor foundation upon which to build a life. So they chose to build upon something stronger, each other. The community that emerged from the crucible of fire and betrayal was unlike any other. It was a strange and beautiful hybrid. The straight lines of the settlement began to soften, to blend with the land. Thorn, the man whose hatred had once been as vast as the plains, now taught the settler children how to read the signs of the earth, his voice patient as he explained the lessons he had learned from the warrior he once swore to kill. Elias, his quiet wisdom a balm to the community, became a keeper of stories, both the settlers' tales and the Apache legends he learned from Ashok. And at the center of this new world was a girl of two names. As Seraphina, she learned her letters. As Little Dove, she learned the songs of her ancestors and the language of the wind. She moved between both worlds with an effortless grace, a living symbol of the peace they had all fought so hard to create. Achak watched her, his heart a vessel so full of a love he thought long dead that he sometimes felt it might break. He was a protector, a teacher, a father. The settlers, who had once seen him as a savage, now looked to him with a respect that bordered on reverence. They had created more than a community. They had created a family, bound not by blood, but by the shared conviction that home was not a place you own, but a promise you defended together. One afternoon, during a sudden, violent thunderstorm, Achak and Thorn were caught out on a hunt and took refuge in a deep, hidden cave. As the storm raged outside, they lit a torch, its flickering light dancing across the ancient stone walls. And there, revealed in the firelight, was a story that had been waiting for centuries to be read. The walls were covered in pictographs, the painted history of Achak's own ancestors. They depicted hunts and droughts and battles. But as Achak moved deeper into the cave, his breath caught in his throat. The final, largest painting depicted a warrior, his face marked with the unmistakable symbols of Achak's own clan. The warrior stood on a high mesa, identical to the one where Achak had faced the captain, and his hand was outstretched, not to an enemy, but to the spirits of the land. It was a depiction of a sacred pact, a promise made by his bloodline to be the eternal guardians of this valley. The revelation was like a current of lightning through Achak's soul. His entire journey, every painful step, was reignited. He had not stumbled upon this place by accident. He had not been led here merely by grief. He had been called home. His long, agonizing pilgrimage to his wife's grave had been the final, unknowing step in fulfilling a destiny he never knew he had. He came to mourn a single soul, and in doing so had become the protector of the soul of the land itself. The fight for his daughter was inextricably woven into the ancient fight for his ancestral home. The warrior's journey is never truly over, but sometimes in a quiet valley where the water runs clear and the laughter of a child echoes in the setting sun, he can find a place to rest. Achak came to a grave seeking an ending, a place to lay down his sorrow. Instead, he found a beginning. He discovered that the truest courage is not found in the heat of a final battle, but in the quiet daily choice to build a future in the shadow of a threat. He learned that a family is not just the blood you are born with, but the people you are willing to bleed for. And he understood with a certainty that settled into his very bones that home is not a piece of ground to be conquered, but a feeling of peace worth dying to protect. His personal journey had become a legend, a story that would be whispered in the valley for generations. The story of the Apache warrior who went to his wife's grave and found not the ghost of his past, but the living, breathing future of his people. If you enjoyed this journey, tell us which part of the world you're watching this story from by leaving a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.